The president and I had a conversation on this very topic, but the conversation was not about China as much as it is about the enduring and important direct relationship that the United States has with Ghana and with African nations.
America about the Chinese activities on the continent, but there's no such obsession here about China is one of the many countries with whom Ghana is engaged in the world.
One of the things I don't see with China is that they're not going into different African countries and saying, you need to be a democracy, or you need to be communist, or you need to be this. China doesn't really care. You know, the big thing with China, the most simple way to describe it, we do this for that. Okay, we'll build you a road, you give us this. We'll build you an airport, you give us this. You know, China's strategic. There's a reason why they want to be in Africa, right? They need those minerals and resources as well. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. I mean, I think China's very honest on why they're there as well. Africa's big enough. There's 54 countries here. Africa is a big enough continent for both the US and China to engage and do business with. So we're going to come and get our share as well. And here we are 23 years later. China's trade with Africa is now 5 times that of the United States.
Welcome back again to my channel. I go by the name King Kwesi. If you're here for the first time and you like the content I put on my channel from China, I will urge you to subscribe to my channel, like this video, share, and let's grow. When I met Cyrus, I decided to engage him in this conversation because he has broad knowledge when it comes to international politics, China relations with other countries, the BRIC formation, and other matters that is very, very of importance to the world. What is China's presence in Africa all about? People are of the view that China is trying to trap Africa into debt. That is why Africa is engaging China more than the Western countries. People also believe that China is after Africa's resources, that China's presence in Africa is not for win-win cooperation. So I decided to engage Cyrus in this conversation to know his views about China and Africa relationship. Make sure you check out his channel. He has broad knowledge when it comes to China and international relationship with other countries. Make sure you head to his channel and subscribe so together we can grow. Let's go deep into the conversation. Let's talk about China and Africa relationship. Is China after Africa's resources? Is China in Africa to trap Africa into debt? Is China trying to take over Africa? These are some of the matters we talk about in this conversation. Make sure you watch the end, subscribe, share this video, and let's grow. Peace out.
China. Over the last several decades, China has been pumping resources into Africa. The country has invested hundreds of billions of dollars across the continent, ranging in everything from transportation and infrastructure to real estate and technology.
So over the years, Africa was working with the US and the Western countries as developing partners, but there has been a shift from that to China.
Yeah.
Why do you think Africa is now looking up to China more than the Western countries and the US?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting from what I've observed. I've made a couple videos about, you know, the U.S. and Africa and the China and Africa and this relationship. One of the things that we notice that's really important here, King, is that China, basically the way that China is engaging with Africa, right? There's 54 countries in Africa, and when China looks at Africa, they look at it as 54 individual countries. And they treat each country individually. They understand the needs and wants of each country. In the United States, you know, one of the unfortunate things is we had this summit of the Africas, where we basically invited all the African leaders to Washington, D.C., okay? And I think there was very much a negative sentiment from many of the African leaders because the entire time, everything was, well, Africa, it's great that you're here. Africa, this is what you need. This is what the United States is going to do for Africa. And a lot of the leaders did not like this kind of broad paintbrush where they basically just say, this is Africa, right? You know, they want that individual respect. And the other interesting thing is that every time that the United States goes to Africa, it gives a lecture to the leaders about China. You know, and it's essentially what we're doing right now is we are so worried about China's engagement in the continent that American leaders are going to Africa essentially saying, don't do business with China, only do business with us. Here's some interesting statistics. 20 years ago, China almost had no presence in Africa. Right around the turn of the century, China's trade with Africa was very, very minimal. And the United States had a very large lead. Now, in the last 23 years, you know, America had a very large lead, but China has now 5x'd the trade between Africa and China. And this is the interesting thing. The United States, we're so worried about stopping China in Africa. Meanwhile, when China came in, They didn't worry about the United States. They said, hey, you're already doing business with the US. No problem. Just do business with us as well. And that's the different mentality there. That's the mentality, and that's why China didn't worry about the United States already being the big leader. China just said, hey, the world's big enough, Africa's big enough, there's 54 countries here. Africa's a big enough continent for both the US and China to engage and do business with, so we're gonna come and get our share as well. And here we are 23 years later, China's trade with Africa is now 5 times that of the United States.
US official will come to Africa and tell us how much better they are compared to the Chinese. And then the Chinese diplomat will come and tell us how much they can offer us and what they're willing to do for us, and how they're not like the US. They won't boss us around and they won't push their policies on us. We've seen it all go down in recent years.
And I watched one of your videos, you said that the US saw Africa as a problem. Why did you say that?
You know, I think this is an interesting one from a U.S. perspective, is that, you know, we look at Africa, for example, as, you know, there's problems there. For example, you know, not everybody has enough access to water. Not everybody has enough access to food. There's, you know, medical, you know, there's hospitals that need to be built. There's, you know, people need medical treatment. There's, you know, a lack of roads and things like that. So we kind of look at Africa and say, you know, there's a lot of problems that need to be solved there. Whereas I think with China, I say that China looks at Africa as an opportunity, because, you know, you have an incredibly developing continent. Africa is already one of the richest continents in the world, with the minerals and the oils and minerals and all of the natural things found in that land already in Africa. And now you have an opportunity where, essentially, if China can go in and build these roads and these ports and these airports and things like that, you're going to open up a new part of the world to do trade and business with. And that's why China looks at it as an opportunity.
Said this.
If you look at the Western and the imperialist countries, they come with their own interests. The vice president of the US came to Zambia, landed at a Chinese-built airport in Zambia, moved on a Chinese-built road in Zambia. The venue of this summit was actually a gift to Zambia by the Chinese government. And that was where this Summit for Democracy was held, in Zambia.
Like people back in Africa, some of them think that China is debt-trapped in Africa.
Yeah. Well,
with this huge infrastructure development going on in Africa.
Yeah, well, I want to know from your perspective, right? Like, tell me, what is China's engagement in Ghana, for example, your home country?
It's great. China has developed major infrastructure projects in Ghana. For example, the Bui Dam was built by the Chinese people.
Okay.
And I've not been home for about 4 years now.
Yeah.
But the last time I went home, there was huge Chinese presence in my country.
Yeah. So how does that make you feel? I mean, when you went back?
If Africa is getting value for its money, then I'm cool.
Yeah. I think
large African infrastructure projects would be viewed as risky by any traditional bank and would therefore struggle to get financed, but China's Export-Import Bank doesn't care. This bank will give low interest or no interest loans to African countries so they can build these trains or dams or other projects.
I think one of the big things that what's interesting with China and their engagement is that there's 2 things I want people to really understand more about the Belt and Road. Number 1 is that Belt and Road projects are largely recipient driven, meaning that it's Ghana reaching out to China saying, hey, we want to build a dam, can you fund this project, right? Here's what it will cost, here's what, you know, this is what we need, can you do it? It's not China going into Ghana saying, we want to do this, this, and this. So that's one thing that many people don't understand. The other thing is that, you know, for example, China also has forgiven some loans, you know, for many African countries. I think they forgive different loans for over 17 countries, and I think that what we have to understand is that you're going to have to make that investment. Okay, I'll give you an example. Here in China, there's over 60,000 kilometers of high-speed rail in the country. Now, has this been profitable for China? Well, no. I mean, there's obviously a huge upfront cost to build all that. Have they received all the money back? Of course not. No. It's going to take a long time to do that. But if you look at China with the strategic vision of how do we connect 1.4 billion people, how do we increase commerce? You know, a simple example is when I first came to Shanghai in 2007, you know, to go from Shanghai to Suzhou was over an hour train ride away. Right now it's you know, less than
30, 40 minutes.
Yeah, now it's less than 30 minutes, right? And you can get, I mean, so you could theoretically live in Suzhou
and work in Shanghai.
And you could commute, you know, just by the high-speed rail. And so all of a sudden, that now has made Shanghai a much bigger area. I mean, it's now like Shanghai Suzhou is kind of one big business conglomerate. that are doing a lot of trade in between the cities. We see the same thing with Beijing and Tianjin, for example. Very much that it's kind of one major economy, but the transportation there has been a big part of that. So yes, I mean, I think we look at, I mean, we got to be fair, right? I mean, there's a lot of projects that have put countries under a lot of debt, but you also, there's a cost to things, right? Like if you have to spend money to make money, right? You're going to have to build, and that's the thing that I always say is if you look at America's engagement, we've done a lot for the continent of Africa and many of the countries there, but a lot of times what we'll do is, for example, we'll send humanitarian relief. Okay, there's a natural disaster in Africa. We'll send medical supplies, food, water. Very, very good. That's helpful. But it's more like putting a Band-Aid on something, like we're going to help you through this difficult time. What happens after that water and the Band-Aid and the food is gone? You're still the same thing. How do we get African people a pathway to contributing in this global economy? Well, they need airports, they need roads, they need ports. They need to have things where they can build things and then start shipping things and start having an economy, right? And that is where the opportunity exists in Africa. Whereas if we can build up that infrastructure, Africa has a great opportunity to become a more influential player in this global economy.
But people also think that China is trying to colonize Africa, in quotes.
Right.
China touts the fact that their foreign investment and aid is no strings attached, with no requirements on factors like respect of human rights or democratic elections.
We do not interfere in the internal affairs of African countries, impose our will on African countries, or attach any political conditions on economic aid.
That's right, baby. China has been making it rain in Africa. It's the most...
Well, I mean, this is interesting. I mean, I think the colonization, because one of the things we see is that, I mean, here's a great statistic. China has not seized a single asset from a country defaulting, okay? And in the 10 years, this is the 10-year anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative, and in the 10 years of existence, there has not been a single case where China has collected an asset because somebody defaulted, okay? What has happened is a lot of people will reference a port in Sri Lanka, okay? And they'll say, hey, well, what about this port in Sri Lanka? Now the China, they couldn't make those debt payments, and you know what? China now controls that. Well, the Sri Lankan government basically said, we can't operate this, can we lease this out to you? So again, it was the Sri Lankan government that went to China and asked them for their help. Can you take this over? And again, it's a lease from China. It's not like they own it, it's a lease, so they're leasing that project out. I mean, one of the things I don't see with China is that they're not going into different African countries and saying, you need to be a democracy, or you need to be communist, or you need to be this. China doesn't really care. The big thing with China, the most simple way to describe it, we do this for that, okay? We'll build you a road, you give us this. We'll build you an airport, you give us this. China's strategic. There's a reason why they want to be in Africa, right? They need those minerals and resources as well. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. I mean, I think China's very honest on why they're there as well. Africa's a very rich continent, but it's always this ability of we'll do this for that. Is China building military bases in Africa? I think they own one, and I think it's in Djibouti,
yeah.
right? But and the reason for that is because of the piracy in the waters. And you can understand China having a tremendous amount of shipping containers that travel around Africa and around the world. I think that military base is probably welcome there, because I know it's not just China. There's a big presence of many countries in Djibouti, working on this big issue of piracy.
So you think the average African should not be worried about the Chinese presence in Africa?
I mean, I mean, from my perspective, I mean, I think you're very qualified to answer that, because I mean, you'd have a better connection into Ghana and your fellow Africans. But I don't think we look at the loan terms from the African loans. I mean, they're very long loans at very favorable interest rates. If you're loaning a country money, I mean, obviously you want a return on that money. There's nothing wrong with giving somebody a loan. I don't think that China is trying to overtake Africa. I think they're really, look at what China does around the world. It's all about business. That's what China does.
What should Africa do differently not to be in a position whereby maybe 50 years to come, Africa can be owned by China?
It's a good question, King. I mean, I think what's important is I think that Africa needs to keep the dialogue open with both. I think that's the one thing. For example, if I was an African leader and United States leaders are coming to me and saying only engage with us, I would say I want to engage with both. If you look at Ghana, for example, Ghana's a great country. Ghana is a smaller country, so certainly smaller than U.S. and China. If you're Ghana, if I'm the president of Ghana, of course I want to engage with both the United States and China. right? I mean, both countries are great countries, both are superpowers, and both are great countries to do business with. So I think very similar where, we've shifted to this multipolar world, and I think it's a similar thing where we want to see, people are shifting to the multipolar world, meaning they want to have other options than just the United States dollar. I think you're going to see the same thing where, I don't think you'd want to be a country and say, we're going to work exclusively with China. You want to work with China because it's the world's factory. So many of the things that we use in the world today are built in China. But I think you still want to have that engagement with the US and with Europe and wherever you can do business. That's the purpose of living in a global economy.
So is China not pushing its political agenda to African countries?
I don't see that at all. China doesn't do that. China does not export communism. That is one of the key principles, is that China does respect the sovereignty of countries. It definitely respects whatever politics you are. I mean, that's one thing that China does not do. That's one thing that the United States does do, right? We tend to we will segregate. I remember when the United States welcomed in leaders from Latin America and the Caribbean, for example, we said, well, we don't want to invite Cuba. We don't want to invite Venezuela because we don't like their government. And there was other leaders. For example, Mexico's president, he said, well, I'm not going to go to your meeting then, because if we're having a meeting of the Americas and the Caribbean nations and Central and South America, if we're going to be excluding certain people because of their government, that's not representative. They're still in that area, right? I mean, they're still in that. So, for example, if we're going to start segregating the countries and saying, well, you're a government that I like, we can do business with you, but you're a government that I don't like, I don't want to do business with you, that's a very short-sighted view, in my opinion, because you want to be engaging with everybody. When it comes down to trade, that's how barriers can be broken down. That's exactly how the United States and China relationship started, because our leaders back in the 1970s realized, hey, we have very different political systems, but one thing that we can do that's a two-way street that we can both win is going to be that trade, and being able to do trade. Because if our American companies are going over to China and building stuff there, it's going to be beneficial to Americans, but it's also going to be beneficial to Chinese people as well. And that's why, both America and China have had a great relationship and why they've had so much growth. But it's also why I think African countries are doing better now because of their engagement with China.
To tell African people don't work with China. Right?
And the key agenda of this summit was to curb Africa's cooperation with China in a Chinese gift to the African continent. One of our major referral hospitals in Zambia, which is called Levi Mwanawasa Teaching Hospital, was a gift to the Zambian people by China. But even in Zambia, very few people know that this hospital was a gift. Zambia did not pay $1 for that hospital.
If tomorrow we wake up and 54 African countries becomes a borderless, because in Ghana, I need a visa to go to South Africa, I need a visa to go to Morocco, I need a visa to go to other countries in Africa. So if tomorrow Africa becomes borderless, is it a threat to the world?
I don't think that would.
Assuming Africa has one currency,
yeah,
and Africa is borderless, is it a threat to the world?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I never thought about that. I mean, I think I don't see how that would be a threat to the world, to be honest. I mean, if Africa became borderless and everybody was able to, if it was similar to the EU, basically becoming a very large trade bloc like the European Union that uses a unified currency, everybody can travel freely within the borders, I think that would be probably a good thing for Africa. I mean, I think it's been a better thing for the EU. I mean, there's certainly many countries that have benefited from EU membership, and I think that's been beneficial for trade and commerce. And I think it would be, in my opinion, I think it would be a good thing.
All right, in his opinion, it would be a good thing for Africa. Thank you so much for talking to me, man. I appreciate your time.
Absolutely.
And I hope that the world will be a better place for all of us, even not for our time, for our children.
Absolutely. That's what we all want.
Thank you so much.
My brother. Thank you, King.